Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. October 1942, Station 105, Chelmsford Airfield, England. Picture the surgical tent, a dim, tense space filled with the scent of antiseptic and the quiet, strained breathing of a young navigator lying on the operating table. Colonel Malcolm Cummings Grow leaned over him, hands moving with precise urgency, extracting jagged fragments of German flak from the man's chest. Each shard had sliced through his leather jacket as effortlessly as a knife through parchment. Grow's mind cataloged the scene with the cold efficiency of experience, yet each sight brought a sting of frustration. He had seen it all before, countless times in recent weeks, the signature wound pattern of low-velocity projectiles. These fragments had already lost much of their energy before piercing flesh, leaving a haunting question dangling in the air. If only there had been anything between this young man's skin and the deadly metal hurtling from the skies above. Outside the tent, the world carried on in relentless rhythm. Engines coughed and roared as another B-17 landed after a daylight raid deep into Hitler's Reich. In the distance, more ambulances approached, their sirens cutting through the autumn chill. The arithmetic of survival was growing unbearable. Nearly 70% of the wounded streaming through his field hospital bore the same grim signature: slower-moving missiles, chunks of aircraft torn loose by flak explosions, fragments from shells bursting at 20,000 feet. These were the silent killers inside the cramped fuselages. The young navigator would live. Others that day would not. And as Colonel Grow stepped back from the operating table, a revelation crystallized in his mind, one that would alter the grim calculus of aerial warfare. These wounds were not inevitable. Protection already existed. It had existed for centuries. All it required was the right question asked in the right place. Within months, that question would save the first of what would eventually become thousands of lives. The unraveling of unprotected bomber crews had begun on August 17, 1942. That was the day the 97th Bomb Group launched the first American heavy bomber mission of the war. 18 B-17 Flying Fortresses crossed the English Channel to strike the marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in occupied France. Major Paul Tibbets led 12 bombers to the main target, while 6 others flew a diversion. All returned intact, but the relatively light resistance along the French coast was deceptive. As the 8th Air Force pushed deeper into German-held skies through the autumn and winter of 1942, the casualty numbers began painting a grim, sobering picture, one that defied every assumption about daylight precision bombing. October brought the first comprehensive analysis of 8th Air Force combat casualties. British hospitals provided the raw data. Each wounded airman logged, cataloged, dissected for patterns. The findings stunned military planners who had long assumed the primary threat came from Luftwaffe fighters. Instead, the truth was both simpler and more horrifying. Roughly 70% of all wounds sustained by bomber crews came from low-velocity projectiles, not bullets from Focke-Wulfs or Messerschmitts, but fragments of exploding anti-aircraft shells and pieces of their own bombers torn apart by flak bursts. The anti-aircraft environment over occupied Europe was unlike anything American air planners had imagined. German Flugabwehrkanonen flak guns had been honed through years of combat, thousands of them strategically positioned around critical targets. The ubiquitous Adal 8mm gun could send shells soaring beyond 30,000 feet, each carrying a time-delay fuse designed to detonate midair, scattering hundreds of lethal shards across the sky. Colonel Grow grasped the human cost instantly. The October analysis made the statistics brutally clear. The majority of fatal wounds struck the torso. Chest injuries alone accounted for 36% of deaths among unarmored crews. Abdominal wounds added another 39%. Together, wounds to the body's core caused 3/4 of all fatalities. The solution seemed mathematically simple: protect the torso, save lives. But translating that insight into action would prove far from straightforward. In 1942, the United States Army Air Forces had no program for body armor. The very idea had fallen out of favor during World War I, when steel vests proved too heavy for infantry soldiers who relied on mobility more than protection. But aviation was an entirely different battlefield. Bomber crews were already weighed down by oxygen equipment, parachutes, and thick flying suits. They worked in tight, claustrophobic spaces where agility mattered far less than survival. And most crucially, their adversary was not the high-velocity bullet, but a more insidious foe, the slower-moving, tumbling fragments of exploding flak. Gross, with his surgical training and intimate knowledge of wound ballistics, saw what military planners could not. A fragment hurled from a flak shell, having traveled 200 yards from the blast to the aircraft, had already lost much of its initial energy. Such a projectile, traveling between 500 and 1,000 feet per second, could be stopped by relatively thin steel. The same principle applied to shards of aircraft torn loose by explosions. These were not armor-piercing bullets screaming at 3,000 feet per second. They were exhausted fragments, spinning and tumbling, their fury spent before striking the men inside. By October 1942, Grow had drafted a proposal for the 8th Air Force Headquarters, urging the development of personal armor for bomber crews. The proposal leaned heavily on casualty analysis and included preliminary sketches of a vest constructed from overlapping steel plates sewn into fabric, an idea drawn from history. Medieval brigandine armor had used the same method, small overlapping plates that offered flexibility while still protecting the wearer's vital areas. Air Force leadership greeted the proposal with skepticism. Weight was the first objection. Crews were already burdened with roughly 40 pounds of gear, parachutes, oxygen systems, and flying suits. Could they realistically carry more? Cost and production capacity were also in question, as was the simple matter of whether crews would actually wear the vests in combat. Some argued that improving fighter escort might save more lives than providing armor ever could. Grow refused to be deterred. He proposed a limited field trial: produce a small batch of armor, issue it to crews, and monitor casualty rates against unarmored counterparts. Let the evidence speak for itself. Headquarters agreed, but with a caveat. The armor had to be developed quickly and outside the Army Air Force's usual supply channels. The military simply did not have the capacity to produce body armor on short notice. Grow turned to the British for help. The Royal Air Force had already experimented with body armor for bomber crews, but abandoned the effort. British bombers, particularly the Avro Lancaster, had such cramped interiors that bulky vests were impractical. But the American B-17 and B-24, while tight by civilian standards, offered slightly more room. What failed in RAF bombers might succeed in American aircraft. Through British connections, Gross linked up with the Wilkinson Sword Company, a firm with a surprising pedigree in armor production. Founded in 1772, Wilkinson had earned its reputation crafting swords, bayonets, and later razors. It also retained expertise in metallurgy and a long history of armor work dating back to Victorian times, when it produced bulletproof vests for officers in colonial conflicts. During World War I, Wilkinson had manufactured body armor for officers, though its weight made it unpopular. By World War II, the company's main output had shifted to aircraft fire suppression systems, but the technical knowledge for armor remained. In October 1942, Gross arrived at Wilkinson's facility, carrying his designs and detailed medical data. What followed was a rare collaboration: military medicine and civilian manufacturing fused with a single goal: saving lives. Gross contributed knowledge of wound ballistics and human anatomy. Wilkinson brought expertise in metalworking and production engineering. Together, they refined the vest through countless iterations, each weighing the delicate balance of protection, flexibility, and weight. The final design consisted of 3 components. The main vest covered the front and back of the torso. A separate apron shielded the lower abdomen and groin. A third piece could be added for specialized crew positions, such as the ball turret gunner exposed to unique threat angles. Each section featured overlapping 2-inch squares of manganese steel, roughly 1 millimeter thick, sewn into pockets within a heavy canvas shell and backed with soft cotton for comfort. The choice of manganese steel was pivotal. It was hard enough to deflect or stop reduced velocity fragments, yet thin enough to remain wearable. Each square weighed only a few ounces, but collectively they protected vital areas without imposing prohibitive weight. The complete vest and apron tipped the scales at about 22 pounds. Substantial, yes, but manageable when measured against the lives it could save. Ingeniously, the design included a quick-release system, red cords and fasteners that could jettison the entire armor suit instantly, addressing concerns for crew egress during emergencies or bailouts. By early 1943, Wilkinson had produced prototype suits. Testing began in March, with crews receiving the British-made armor on early missions. The results were immediate and compelling. Wounded airmen arrived at field hospitals wearing battered vests that had stopped flak fragments in their tracks. Medical officers inspected the steel plates and found embedded fragments, halted before penetrating flesh. The relatively thin manganese steel had performed exactly as predicted, defeating the spent, tumbling shards that had so often taken lives. By spring 1943, word of the armor's effectiveness began to spread across 8th Air Force bases in England. Demand surged, and it quickly outstripped British production capacity. Wilkinson, already committed to other war priorities, could produce perhaps 100 suits per month, far short of the thousands needed to outfit the growing bomber fleet. By the summer of 1943, Colonel Gross had shifted his focus to domestic production. The War Department authorized immediate manufacturing of American-made body armor, a move that required unprecedented collaboration between military arsenals and civilian institutions, most notably the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. There, the museum's armor workshop, staffed with medieval armor experts and master craftsmen, became the primary research hub for adapting centuries-old designs to the demands of modern aerial warfare. Stephen Grancy, curator of the museum's Arms and Armor Department, led the effort. In a 1945 article for the Metropolitan Museum of Art Bulletin, he recounted the process. The design of Armor Vest M6, now the standardized flyer's armor, is based on one of the museum's brigandines dating from around 1400. Suits of armor in the exhibition halls are constantly studied for suggestions. No type showing even the slightest promise is overlooked. Heavy jousting armor, lighter battle armor, chainmail, scale armor, and quilted Renaissance jackets all were examined for potential adaptation. This unusual partnership brought together two worlds rarely allied in wartime. Museum craftsmen, usually dedicated to restoring priceless historical artifacts, were now designing life-saving equipment for bomber crews. Centuries of armor expertise, honed for knights and colonial officers, was suddenly vital for men fighting above Germany in the skies of World War II. American production began in mid-1943, with multiple facilities turning out variations of the basic design. The standard M1 vest replaced canvas with nylon for the outer shell, improving both water resistance and durability, while retaining cotton backing for comfort. The steel plates remained the same specification developed with Wilkinson's sword. Production quickly scaled up as manufacturers across the United States received contracts. On October 5, 1943, the M1 Flyer's vest was officially adopted as standard issue for all 8th Air Force bomber crews. The authorization memorandum stipulated that every crew member would be issued armor appropriate to their position in the aircraft. It was a monumental logistical challenge. The 8th Air Force was expanding rapidly that autumn, with new bomb groups arriving in England monthly, each requiring hundreds of suits. The M1 weighed 17 pounds and 6 ounces lighter than the British Wilkinson model thanks to improved plate arrangement and fabric selection. Modifications were made for specific positions. Pilots and co-pilots, already protected by armored seats, received the M2 vest with reduced rear coverage. Ball turret gunners got the M3 apron, designed for cramped quarters. Waist gunners wore the M4 apron optimized for standing positions, and bombers, navigators, and other seated personnel added the M5 groin armor to supplement the main vest. This modular system allowed crews to configure protection based on their unique exposure to flak and fragments. Initial reluctance to wear the armor vanished quickly once crews experienced it in combat. By early 1944, the program expanded further to include additional protective equipment. The M3 helmet, specifically developed for bomber crews, offered superior shrapnel protection compared to standard infantry helmets. Known as the Gross helmet after its inventor, it used 5 overlapping manganese steel strips over a leather flying helmet base capable of stopping fragments that would penetrate conventional designs. A comprehensive study by 8 Air Force medical officers compared casualty rates of armored versus unarmored crews. Examining 117 battle casualties from heavy bombardment groups, the study revealed astonishing results. Among crews without armor, chest wounds accounted for 36% of fatalities and abdominal wounds 39%. Among armored crews, these figures fell to 8% and 7%, a 77.1% reduction in thoracic fatalities and an 82.1% reduction in abdominal deaths. Additional analysis showed a 58% reduction in individuals wounded and a 60% reduction in total wounds sustained. The armor was not a miracle. Head wounds remained lethal, limb injuries continued to cause casualties, fragments striking at extreme angles sometimes penetrated gaps, and large caliber projectiles could defeat the thin steel plates. Yet the M1 succeeded at its primary mission, stopping the majority of slower-moving fragments that posed the greatest threat to bomber crews. October 14, 1943, Black Thursday tested the limits of daylight bombing and the new armor. On the second raid against the Schweinfurt ball-bearing factories, 2 N-91 B-17 bombers were dispatched. 60 aircraft were lost, 17 more damaged beyond repair, and 121 returned with battle damage. The losses were catastrophic, exceeding 20% of the attacking force. Yet when medical officers examined returning crews, the impact of armor was clear. Damaged vests bore embedded fragments, evidence that without protection, casualties would have been even higher. Even so, armor could not overcome the fundamental hazards of strategic daylight bombing in 1943. Even with improved protection, crews faced overwhelming odds during the darkest months of the air war, where survival often depended as much on luck as on technology. The true turning point for bomber operations in World War II came not from armor alone, but from the arrival of long-range fighter escort. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang, with the range to accompany bombers deep into Germany, altered the tactical balance. These fighters could engage German interceptors before they reached the vulnerable formations of B-17s and B-24s. When combined with the protective steel vests, the synergy was remarkable. By spring 1944, survival rates among bomber crews had improved dramatically. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the 8th Air Force had matured into a formidable fighting force. Thousands of aircraft executed precision strikes on French transportation networks and German fortifications. Thanks to the armor program, virtually all bomber crews were equipped with protective vests. Initial production shortages had been overcome. By war's end, American manufacturers had produced 338,580 M1 vests and 95,619 M2 vests, a staggering achievement in such a short span of time. One of the most remarkable aspects of the armor program was the speed of its implementation. From Colonel Gross's initial analysis in October 1942 to full-scale production by late 1943, just a single year had passed. That timeline encompassed design development, prototype testing, contractor selection, production ramp-up, and distribution logistics. The program also embodied extraordinary Allied cooperation. The British provided initial production capacity through Wilkinson's Sword, contributed metallurgical expertise in steel alloys, and supplied 9,600 flak jackets under reverse Lend-Lease. American manufacturers built upon these designs, while the Metropolitan Museum of Art offered design research that refined and improved the final vests. Collaboration spanned unusual organizational boundaries, bringing together military medicine, historical scholarship, metallurgy, and mass production, all in the service of saving lives. Colonel Malcolm Grow continued to innovate throughout the war. Beyond body armor, he developed improved oxygen systems that mitigated hypoxia at high altitudes, pioneered rest homes for combat-stressed crews, and instituted psychiatric screening programs to reduce fatigue and breakdowns. His holistic approach addressed both the physical and mental challenges faced by airmen. In July 1943, Grow received the Legion of Merit for developing body armor and a steel helmet that dramatically reduced casualties and boosted morale. By May 1944, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for a range of innovations: devices to shield gunners from wind blast, electrically heated clothing, gloves, boots, hand warmers, casualty bags, face and neck protection, and special combat rations. Frostbite cases dropped, flight efficiency rose, and medical officers received specialized training to support combat units. After the war, Grow continued to shape military medicine. He was appointed acting air surgeon for the Army Air Forces in 1945 and confirmed as air surgeon in 1946. When the United States Air Force became an independent service in 1947, its medical service initially remained under Army administration. On July 4, 1949, Malcolm Grow became the first Surgeon General of the United States Air Force, serving until November 30, 1949. He retired as a Major General on December 1, 1949, and passed away on October 20, 1960, at age 72, having witnessed the full impact of the armor program he had championed. The lessons learned during World War II influenced subsequent conflicts. The M19 Ifatu vest, issued to ground troops in Korea, replaced steel with ballistic nylon, but retained the modular design principles pioneered by GROW. Vietnam-era flak jackets incorporated improved materials, but continued to follow the same flexible armor concept. Today's ceramic and Kevlar body armor represents technological advancement, yet it rests upon the same foundation: protection against fragments and projectiles to reduce casualties. Every police officer in a bulletproof vest, every soldier protected by modern body armor, owes a debt to the World War II flak vest program. The story of Colonel Grow's innovation is not one of battlefield heroics or cinematic last stands. There were no dramatic duels with enemy fighters, no impossible victories against overwhelming odds. It is, instead, a story of careful observation, rigorous analysis, creative problem-solving, and relentless persistence within bureaucratic structures. Grow saw patterns in the wounds he treated, connected those patterns to a historical solution, collaborated with unlikely partners to develop and test it, and advocated for adoption despite skepticism. He succeeded because the evidence was compelling and the need urgent. The flak vest program demonstrated a fundamental truth. Technology can save lives in the most lethal environments when the right problems are identified and addressed systematically. Protection does not require perfect invulnerability. It requires adequate defense against the most common threats. The M1 Flyer's vest did not stop every fragment, but it stopped most fragments most of the time, and that was enough. The toll of the Allied bomber offensive was immense. By war's end, the 8th and 15th Air Forces together had suffered over 27,000 killed in action and 9,000 wounded. RAF Bomber Command lost over 55,000 men killed, with roughly 18,000 wounded. Against such staggering losses, any measure that improved survival was vital. Body armor proved one of the most effective life-saving initiatives of the entire air war. By reducing overall casualties by 60% and fatal torso wounds by over 77%, it gave airmen dramatically better odds of survival than those who flew the same missions just 2 years earlier. Fighter escort and tactical improvements helped, but body armor addressed the single greatest cause of casualties. Thousands of airmen survived their combat tours and returned home because one surgeon refused to accept that their wounds were inevitable and worked tirelessly to prove otherwise. The legacy of Colonel Malcolm Grow lives on at Andrews Air Force Base, where the Malcolm Grow Medical Center bears his name, a lasting tribute, ensuring that future generations of Air Force medical personnel remember the surgeon who pioneered modern body armor. Yet, the flak vest was only one part of his revolutionary contributions to aviation medicine. Grow also developed protection against wind blast for gunners, electrically heated clothing that reduced frostbite, improved oxygen systems to combat hypoxia at high altitudes, psychiatric support programs, and rest facilities for crews under combat stress. Each innovation addressed a specific problem, systematically identified through careful analysis of medical data and battlefield experience. The connection between historical armor and modern innovation was celebrated in museum exhibits in subsequent decades. The Metropolitan Museum of Art displayed a 15th-century brigandine alongside an M1 Flyer's vest, demonstrating how the centuries-old principle of small layered plates had been adapted to contemporary materials. Museum curators noted that the eternal challenge of warfare protecting those who fight found new solutions through the creative application of historical knowledge. Similarly, the Wilkinson Sword Company, after returning to civilian production of razors and garden tools, retained pride in its wartime contribution. Company histories published later devoted significant attention to their collaboration with Colonel Grow, highlighting how their expertise helped develop protective equipment that saved thousands of American lives. The story of the flak vest program offers lessons that remain relevant decades later. Innovation often comes from unexpected sources. A surgical officer, not a procurement specialist, identified the problem and proposed the solution. A sword manufacturer, not an armor company, supplied initial production capacity. A fine arts museum, not a military research lab, provided critical design insight. The program succeeded because it drew on diverse sources of knowledge and expertise. It also demonstrated the power of data-driven decision-making. Grow's proposal rested on solid medical statistics. Field testing provided clear evidence of effectiveness. Expansion to full-scale production was justified by measurable casualty reductions. At every stage, decisions were grounded in evidence, not assumptions, a rigor that overcame skepticism and bureaucratic resistance. Perhaps most importantly, the program showed that lives could be saved even in lethal environments. In 1942, conventional wisdom held that high casualties over Germany were inevitable. Grow refused to accept this fatalism. He believed that better protection could reduce deaths, even if it could not eliminate them entirely, and he proved it correct. The flak vest program stands as one of the most successful rapid military innovations of World War II. From problem identification in October 1942 to full implementation by late 1943, the timeline encompassed design, prototype testing, contract negotiation, production scaling, and logistics, a remarkable feat for equipment that had to be conceived and deployed from scratch. Its success depended on clear evidence of need, practical design, effective collaboration between military and civilian entities, and unwavering Air Force support. Protecting crews was essential to sustaining the bombing campaign, and the program delivered. In the annals of military medicine, Colonel Grow's development of body armor exemplifies systematic observation and evidence-based innovation. He saw patterns in casualties, identified a preventable cause, designed a practical solution, tested it rigorously, and persevered until it became standard issue. His principles continue to protect military personnel and law enforcement officers today. The fundamental approach remains unchanged. Identify the threat, design appropriate protection, balance weight against effectiveness, test under realistic conditions, and issue as standard equipment. The mathematics of aerial warfare were transformed. Before armor, roughly 36% of crews struck by chest fragments died. After the introduction of body armor, that mortality rate dropped to 8%. Survivability improved, and with it came psychological benefits. Crews flew with greater confidence, commanders could plan bolder missions, and the air campaign gained effectiveness. The story of the flak vest is also a lesson in human ingenuity. Innovation often comes from unexpected places. Bureaucracies can be navigated when stakes are clear. Collaboration across disciplines produces results far beyond isolated efforts. And one determined individual, armed with data, creativity, and relentless advocacy, can change the course of thousands of lives. Colonel Malcolm Grow's flak vest program is a testament to that enduring principle. From the operating table to production lines, from medieval armor to modern aviation, his vision saved lives, reshaped military medicine, and established a model of systematic, evidence-based innovation that echoes into the present. It stands as a reminder. Careful observation, creative problem-solving, and persistent advocacy can overcome even the most daunting challenges when lives hang in the balance. That is the lasting legacy of Colonel Malcolm Grover Surgeon, whose commitment to protecting those who serve left an indelible mark on history